Hi there. Welcome to the latest episode of Sundata TV. Now, I'll just explain on the 1st of July 2021, Sundata merged with Team Computing in Sydney and we formed One Team IT. So you may be watching this as Sundata TV or you may have caught it as One Team TV, but effectively it's a continuation of what started as Sundata TV in 2020. So welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My guest today, I'm very pleased to welcome Fytos Charalambides from Red Hat. I'm going to ask Fytos to explain his role and his background in a moment, but today's subject is Openshift. And I guess I'm putting forward this subject because I'm getting asked a lot about Openshift and really straightforward questions. What is it? Why is it important? And what does it mean to me? So they're the subjects we're going to discuss today with Fytos. Welcome, Fytos, and can I ask you to introduce yourself and your background for our viewers, please?
Good morning, Con. Good to see you again, firstly, and congratulations on the new organisation that's been formed. Great to hear that's been announced. A little bit of background about me. I've been with Red Hat for about 8 years. Prior to that, I worked in healthcare and also worked for Microsoft, which I believe is a partner of yours here at One Team. I joined Red Hat 8 years ago to help them, or help the organisation effectively build a market and find solutions for our customers around the new topology, which was containers back then. And effectively have moved into a director of technology and pre-sales role since that time. So 8 years with Red Hat, about 23 years in the IT industry, involved with a variety of organisations and projects. Quite fortunate. I'd say I have a front row seat to innovation right now. I get to see what's coming. I get to work with some pretty interesting organisations, very innovative organisations, some not so innovative, but taking some change into the way they work. And I work with a great bunch of people here at Red Hat and IBM as well. So happy to be here, and hopefully I can share some insight into the dark art of containers and cloud. It's a hot topic. And there's a variety of reasons why it is hot, but hopefully I can share some insight.
That's great, mate. Thank you, and thanks for your time today. I know containers touches on virtualisation, and it might shock some people to know that virtualisation has been around since the 1960s when IBM introduced it on their mainframes. Most of us know it more recently when VMware came along and shook up the physical server market with their offering, and then Microsoft with Hyper-V. And I guess containers is the next stage of virtualization. So perhaps, and again, if we're treating this as a primer for our audience, and it's not really meant to deep dive into technical nuts and bolts or get lost in the weeds of technology, but perhaps a good place to start is give us your layman's explanation of containers and what they are, and we'll start with that.
Yeah, so as the language or the terminology states, a container is an environment that contains something. And if you look at the shipping industry as an analogy or metaphor here to help explain this, ships effectively carry many, many, many containers. They move them from A to B, and those containers are holding a variety of components, products, material. And the shipping industry is quite advanced. They've figured out how to effectively load onto a single ship thousands of containers stacked high, all ready to be deployed at different ports of call. The word container in the software industry has a similar use or meaning. So containers in the software industry, we're referring to a way of isolating a process or an application runtime. So it consumes its own resource and it's part of a shared pool. So effectively, when you think about virtualization and you look back to the last 20 years of application deployment and development, we've used a 3-tier architecture. So think of the application as the first tier. Think of the virtualization layer possibly as a second tier with the operating system. And then think about the hardware or the environment that application lives on or with. That is a 3-tier model. There's always a thirst in IT to become more efficient and optimized. There's always a need from the business side mainly to do things faster, better, more secure, with higher quality. And there's been a couple of events the last 10, 15 years which have driven acceleration. So obviously the first one is cloud. This move to no-ops has driven a thirst for faster or better speed to market for delivery of services. There's been the GFC as well, which effectively has brought a need to drive costs down, and we saw some very large organizations in the US just disappear. These are iconic orgs. With that came a new mode of operation, costs down, agility up. And then last year we had COVID-19 hit most of the modern world. And essentially that's driven a need to move to digital very, very fast. So with all that being said, containers have become very, very popular. And if you think about an application that's been built with maybe 20 years of development history, it has various modules, features, service delivery that are built into that one application. And typically an organization will pull down that application to make an update, an upgrade, or make changes to that application. What containers bring is the ability to break up that application into smaller bite-sized components and update a component over the entire application. So there's no need to pull down the app. That is a revolutionary change, I'd say, and the ability to share resources as well. So the VM doesn't go away. VMs are still an underlying, architectural feature of containers, but there is a move to bare metal that we're seeing as well.
Okay, so I really like your shipping metaphor, because I know what containers on ships delivered as part of that revolution is that handling of containers got standardized through ports and transport systems around the world. So from a ship that's got thousands of containers, you've got a dock or a port that can handle containers, that can transfer it to different modes of transport, whether it's rail, trucking, or other ships. And even to the extent that businesses have got their own container forklifts and things like that. So that got standardized, which we can all imagine just transformed the productivity of getting stuff from point A to point B. So that's a great metaphor. So in the software space, I guess you're saying that you take a traditional application that might have, say, 10 modules. What you're basically saying is that might map to hundreds of containers, each of them containing a service or a piece of the application that effectively can be pulled down or stood up without affecting the rest of the containers. Is that a fair summary?
It is a fair summary, and effectively what we're describing here inadvertently is microservices, which many of you may have heard about. The ability to break down an application into micro components. Going back to your metaphor, or the shipping metaphor we're using here, and talking about standardization, you just described the open source ecosystem, actually.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. So what happens in the open source ecosystem is projects are spawned. Many organizations, individuals, research orgs contribute. There's debate, and then there's a standard format or product that's agreed upon, which becomes the go-to product that the open source community develops. Right. In order for that product to become useful to an enterprise, you need to also address the ecosystem, the skills side of things, the training component, the infrastructure that is either cloud or on-prem infrastructure. And this is where certifications and standardization are really important. And what Red Hat's been doing for 23 years is they've actually been certifying Red Hat Enterprise Linux on tens of thousands of different hardware specifications, but also they have an ISV and application ecosystem and are certified on most clouds that organizations use today. So essentially that forklift, that driver that has a ticket and is skilled, that truck and that ship that has containers on it. And by the way, those containers are configured in a way where they stack neatly on top of each other and don't move, and they're secure.
Yep.
That is exactly what's been happening in the open source community, and Red Hat's been leading that for a very, very long time. We actually produced the first container product in 2011, before Kubernetes, might be a word that organizations are hearing, before Kubernetes became available in 2015. So that is the ecosystem just there described.
Okay. Well, look, I didn't even know I knew that, so that's great. So you touched on ISVs, and I guess from a perspective of the clients that I deal with, where I'm seeing a move to containerization or containerized applications is that ISVs are bringing that to market, and the next upgrade or the next upgrade after that for clients who use an ERP, for example, their clients are being asked to prepare for a containerized version of the application. So maybe you can touch on what's driving ISVs to transition to, well, I think you may have already touched on it, but maybe just re-summarise, why are ISVs driving hard towards containerising their applications and their offerings?
Well, it's acknowledgement of containers and cloud becoming the go-to architecture. And, Red Hat and customers as well as ISVs respond to market demand. And effectively, we're seeing certification and standardization increase, demand for that increase as well. It's pretty obvious to software organizations, especially software vendors building bespoke ISV type apps, that they need to be ready to run their app on on-prem, private cloud possibly, or just a laptop or a server environment.
Yep.
They need to be certified and ready to run in cloud. They need to also be able to run on IBM topologies like Power systems, for example, and also be able to run on x86 Intel chip type environments as well. So this multi-cloud environment is actually driving ISV decision making. And Red Hat, with the way we've dealt with RHEL as the dominant operating system at present, the way we've dealt with the ecosystem and development roadmap, that's being applied to our Openshift container platform as well. So all the goodness of RHEL sits inside of Openshift. Now, if you look back to 2013-14, Docker popped up as the format or specification for containers. Yep. Red Hat got right behind that. We were all in on Docker. We were happy to contribute to the project, and we made it our default specification. And there was a drive to essentially certify and make sure your Docker environment or application ran in a Docker environment.
Yep.
With that being said, since then, there's been 3 or 4 other formats or specifications that have popped up. So if ISVs want to certify applications for containers, it's not as simple as going and grabbing Docker today. You actually need to think about the entire cloud, private cloud, and other ecosystem, as well as what else are you going to interact with? What other applications or users are you going to have coming in to use your application? And it's quite complex, and there's a lot of wiring, and I call it all the under the table fixes and solutions that aren't very exciting to organizations, but are really important. In a world of security challenges, I don't know if I want to be trying to configure that and manage that and own that myself. So what it's driving is the ISV coming back and talking to lead providers of container platforms to make sure they're certified and ready to run on a container platform.
Okay, so like you touched on Kubernetes before, and I guess we're here to talk about Openshift. So take us down the next step. So you've got an ISV that's containerizing their application or their offering, and they come to Red Hat and they say, we want to certify for containers. So that basically means that they want to certify that they can run in the Openshift environment, which is Red Hat's containerized offering. Is that a fair summary, or help me out with the words here?
Yeah, no problem at all. So Kubernetes is a container orchestration solution, and it was developed with Google. So Red Hat and Google teamed up and open sourced Google's container orchestration indexing product they use online for their search engine.
Yep.
And Red Hat, to this day, is the number 2 contributor to that project, sits on about 17 special interest groups around storage and software-defined networking and documentation. So Openshift is actually Kubernetes, but it's Kubernetes that's been taken from the upstream community and made enterprise ready. And then when that Kubernetes engine is enterprise ready and able to run on Linux or Windows or Power systems, it's then given access to things like storage, software-defined networking, security. So think of the security that's spawned out of defense departments and banking sector that's in RHEL. Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's also in Openshift. And then we make it easy for ISVs to certify, and it's ubiquitous certification because we use a native Kubernetes instance that is the same as upstream, but made enterprise ready. Their certification is certification to run on Kubernetes. So we have a way of doing this through what we call, and I don't want to get too technical, operators. And you create an operator for your ISV app, and it runs on Openshift. Now, Openshift also runs on Microsoft Arrow as a managed service. We have a co-engineered version of Openshift. You don't always have to install Openshift. So if you're a Microsoft user and you want to use containers and you want to be sure that you're using a certified platform that has all those things I described, then you would go to Microsoft and you would say, I would like to use Arrow. So it's Azure, Red Hat, Openshift. It's a managed service, and you use it as per the way you consume services on Arrow or Azure today. So it's all there. We've made it simple. And that's why Forrester has Red Hat as the leader in the container development space. So I can give you some stats here. We went from 1,200 customers to 3,000 in less than a year off the back of the popularity of what we're delivering to market at the moment. So yeah, that's the way I would do it, and that's the way ISVs effectively engage.
Okay, so for me to go and explain it to a client, effectively Kubernetes is the if you like the base functionality around orchestrating containers, and OpenShift is, if you like, the Rolls-Royce bundle that builds in a lot of other functionality like security, as you mentioned, so that an organisation doesn't have to build their own solutions in those sort of utility spaces around the containers.
Yes, but another way to describe it is, I think, I agree with your analogy, but I would say that Kubernetes is the raw ingredient.
Yep.
So if I go and take Kubernetes from the open source community, you're getting an orchestration platform with lots of APIs that you need to manage, and then you need the skills. And think about Australia at the moment with the skills shortage. Those skills aren't present. So that's a challenge. But secondly, it's not going to function as an orchestration platform after you download it. There's a lot of work that needs to go into it. So for example, Red Hat does 300 security and bug fixes a month for Kubernetes to maintain the upstream project so it's actually at a point of stability. And that all feeds back into OpenShift. That's just the Kubernetes component. So you need Kubernetes to orchestrate, but you also need a good operating system, which makes the product portable so you can run it anywhere. And all those certifications with Red Hat Enterprise Linux come with then Kubernetes. But then also you need the application development layer to attract your developers to want to use the platform.
Well, that's a point that, I know, and we touched on organisations that might have had a 20-year-old ERP. And there's still a lot of those that are effectively home or in-house developed with in-house teams. And I know a challenge that a lot of clients have is that their developers, I was shocked the other day that a client told me that his .NET development team is aging, and he's finding it hard to attract young developers to the .NET environment. And I know we went through this with earlier generations of development platforms as well. So if we're talking to an organisation that's got a substantial in-house developed and maintained application, again, what are the nuances in terms of moving to a containerised or containerising that application over time in terms of challenges and benefits for that organisation? And what's the imperative?
That's a great question, because Red Hat and Microsoft have been collaborating on exactly that question for the last 5 years. Microsoft acknowledged that open source is the future and invested heavily in obviously Azure and OpenShift and the upstream open source community. With that collaboration that Red Hat and Microsoft have engaged in together, we do have support for running OpenShift on a Windows environment and running mixed environment. So if you take your .NET frameworks and your .NET applications and you port them into OpenShift through a container, that .NET environment can run side by side with Java and with other environments as well, Node.js, etc. So suddenly your developer is working with a wider team and working with a broad sense of development tools and technologies. Why is that important? Well, that .NET developer that you're talking about that might be aging, or that skill might be rare. Suddenly your application can take advantage of other development languages with other modules. Remember that microservices architecture we talked about?
Yep.
You have a mixed bag. So essentially the skills of the .NET developer come across the container platform automatically. The Windows investment doesn't go away. And suddenly you've got a mixed environment that you can work with. Also, if you really want to adopt cloud, you just go to Microsoft and you use either Arrow or all the .NET tools up on Microsoft's site, the cloud, and effectively you've got access to containers immediately. So it's been thought through, and it's a great question because those two worlds used to live separately, but at the moment they're converging, and there's a blurring of the lines, and there's transferability of skills here. So the skills you use to basically go from development to test to prod through a pipeline on Openshift, they're the same for a Windows or .NET developer as it is for a Java developer. And suddenly you're building cloud native applications in a standard way, and you can scale your apps up and down as needed.
Okay, so you're describing a nirvana, and you'd be like me. Most organisations would, when you talk about development, they'd say, "Oh, we're a insert language here shop, right? We're a .NET shop, or in earlier days, we're a COBOL or an RPG shop, or whatever." What you're basically describing is an environment where you break the application down into smaller and smaller components, which effectively can be development language independent. That's what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, and there's a word for it. We call it polyglot development. It's an emerging theme where you have Java, .NET, Node.js, and other frameworks all intertwined to develop application solutions. The skills of a Java development transfer nicely to a Quarkus development environment, which is a new Java language. The .NET developer might want to reskill, for example, and then with that comes the safety or the guardrails. So you've got the platform that can serve up the different languages in different containers, and those containers have the same specification. You've got the security bounding that, and then you've got the pipeline where you've got dev, test, and prod. And it neatly flows regardless of language you're using. So those skills around development pipelines, application development, and the way software moves from development to prod are not different. But if you were to do this in the traditional method or using a 3-tier architecture, they would be different because you'd be using different pipeline integration tools and pipeline injection tools. Openshift fixes that problem. So it's quite standard, quite consistent. And think about the skills shortages today. I believe in future you won't be able to choose your development language. Maybe you need to effectively go with what's in market as an available skill, and it will be dependent on the application you're building as well.
Okay, there's a lot of implications there. So you're describing this promised land for us. Are there any downsides that you've seen people have to deal with and challenges, like whether it's adapting skills, different culture for development teams? What are you seeing in terms of the challenges?
That's a good question, and I don't have all the answers to that, but I'll observe what I have seen with customers, and we've had we've been doing this for about 5-6 years now, doing some pretty large projects. Macquarie Bank's an interesting one. It's actually on the record demonstrating that it's actually gotten a 50% productivity increase from its developers. Wow. The biggest challenge there wasn't reskilling, but dealing with the cultural shift. So as organizations move to this new world of development, there's a cultural shift that happens, and that's around the developer and the operations team working differently. And that's where DevOps comes from. Now, DevOps and Agile are open source constructs, so we understand these quite well. It requires developers and operations people to possibly share platforms and work together differently, where operations might manage the capacity of the Openshift platform and developers build the applications. Now, as the platform has developed over time, we've addressed some of this by providing ways of sharing information through metrics, providing dashboards, but also allowing developers to manage security or request more nodes or clusters or containers. So cultural is one. The other one is, I think leadership needs to get behind this approach. the return is enormous. There's a paper from IDC called The Business Value of Openshift. It quantifies millions of dollars over a short period of time in return. That comes from the cost optimization, so the reduction in infrastructure needed to run this. It comes from the developer productivity. It also comes from the cohesiveness of the team. So when you've got teams working together differently and better, you have less attrition, you've got happier staff, more motivated staff, and developers stay. Now, one of the challenges is leadership changing the mindset of the team, but also leadership changing their own mindset. So leaders need to think differently about how they develop applications for the business. And I think the business is putting pressure on leaders to respond. We saw that with COVID-19 last year, where everything had to go to digital real fast. Those that were down this path already responded. Those that weren't stood out, and questions were asked, obviously, from boards.
Yeah, and certainly I understand we were very much with our clients at the coalface of things that were asked to happen in days or weeks that used to take months, or if not longer. And like you say, the ones that managed to get things stood up thrived, and the ones who lagged behind, they just sort of bumped along the bottom. And that was a real case study in ROI of agility right there and then. So we've got a few minutes left, Fytos. I just want to change gears a bit. We've been talking about the implications from applications and ISVs and developers and that sort of stuff. I'd just like to pivot a little bit to infrastructure and implications for infrastructure managers planning to transition to a containerized environment and looking at deploying. Well, we've talked about Kubernetes compared to deploying Openshift, but so let's just say deploying Openshift. What are the planning implications from an infrastructure layer point of view?
Well, there's some significant process changes that need to be considered. So, I'll recall back to 2013, I think it was, sitting in front of the head of IT for a large insurer and putting forward a proposal with my team that we could reduce the number of IT staff members and infrastructure spend to serve up the same number of applications. And at the time, that leadership wasn't prepared or ready to make those sorts of changes. It was quite confronting. And essentially they felt that it wasn't the right time. Now, what's happened in the last 5 years and 6 years or so, that's changed. Organizations are actually focused on the infrastructure layer. And the first thing they do is move to cloud. And they feel that that's the first thing they need to do. So applications that are cloud ready get moved to cloud. And infrastructure folk either need to reskill or take on a role of managing the private cloud on-prem or the on-prem servers. And they maybe hire new people who have those cloud skills, cloud management skills, to manage the infrastructure in cloud. Infrastructure managers need to think about their team a little bit differently. They need to think about who they reskill and who continues on with the traditional task. One of the biggest changes I've seen in one of the banks in Sydney was it will take them 3 months to issue a new virtualized environment. There would be a ticketing system. It would go through multiple chains of approval. And by the time the server and the environment, the virtualized environment, was provided to the team, the idea that they were trying to instantiate as a development team was losing its value. They weren't able to get it out to market in the window that they needed to. So the change that happens is some of those ticketing processes do disappear. And you have to be comfortable with the idea of developers creating the demand. And some of it's instant, and you have to be thinking like an SRE, so right with linear, and being able to respond. So there's a cultural shift. It's almost like you have to think like a cloud operator on-prem. Yep. And what Openshift does, it actually abstracts that problem and creates that join and provides guardrails. So it actually changes the culture of the team subtly over time.
So you basically, the agile construct basically percolates all through. It's not just about the application, but from as you say, spinning up a VM in 3 months, it doesn't really suit if there's say a new marketing campaign and something's got to be brought up, on very short notice, or things like natural disasters for government. We know that when we have like bushfire or cyclone relief, a lot of functionality gets spun up on very short notice. So getting a response to a ticket that says you've got to wait 3 months for this, probably not appropriate. So that's an interesting layer in terms of preparation. Again, that the agile cultural changes will percolate through, and Openshift basically facilitates that by offering a bunch of the tooling that people will need to do that.
It does, and it also the pipeline. So the way you ask for a new environment, the way you view use the metrics it provides you, the way you manage multiple environments consistently, the way a developer moves applications or code through the pipeline, that's DevOps. Yep. So what Openshift provides is an automation platform for DevOps.
Okay.
It provides the construct for that.
So with respect to DevOps, and maybe I've got labouring under a misapprehension here, DevOps is something that generally I've associated with organisation of a certain scale. Does Openshift mean that DevOps type methodologies will become available to smaller organisations and are justified in smaller organisations?
For the smaller organisation, DevOps is accessible in small bite sizes. So, Openshift, for example, doesn't have to be consumed with multiple nodes. You can start with a 2-core single node, and you can run 10 plus applications on there. And suddenly you're doing DevOps. You could be the single developer that also stands up the service in a small, medium enterprise, and suddenly you're a DevOps engineer. Right. So the beauty of the platform is you can start small, and you don't need to be a bank, a government department, or a telco to take advantage and reap the benefits. So I actually think it's quite suited to those small to medium enterprises who don't have the resource pool they need. It's like they've gained some extra headcount by using Openshift.
Well, if you're talking about a 50% productivity improvement, your two full-time equivalents effectively are doing the output of 3 in simple terms.
Correct. Yeah, you could measure it that way. If you've got one great developer who understands operations, suddenly their productivity doubles. Absolutely.
Okay. So look, just to bring it on to a final topic on the infrastructure side, we've alluded to both Intel as a platform and also IBM Power. And I know that they're both happily certified, and funnily enough, Red Hat is owned by IBM these days, although the identities, from what I can see, have been maintained as separate. Perhaps touching on the pros and cons of the different platforms based on what you've seen. I'm not asking you to pin your flag to any particular mast here, but perhaps pros and cons of x86 versus Power for a home for an Openshift environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you my opinion on x86. x86 is commoditized server infrastructure. In cloud, you get x86 machines. It's great for Java workloads, and it effectively is easy to scale up because you can just add lots more x86 servers to the environment. So for low demand standard application serving or deployment, where you want to add servers to effectively scale, x86 is great. The Intel environment's been great for years, and we're certified on that environment. Where it gets interesting is when you start doing things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, and you need supercomputing backbone. And this is where the power systems are quite strong and quite powerful. So Red Hat has effectively certified Openshift to run on power systems. And what comes with the Red Hat Openshift environment is the NVIDIA chipset GPU support, which is one of the standard chipsets, GPUs that you would want to use if you're doing machine learning type algorithm processing. And we're talking about some very, very heavy type throughput here and algorithm changes. So this is where Power actually comes in and is absolutely perfect for this sort of environment. If you're doing AI ML type activity, and you are probably going to need a container platform because you do micro type AI ML apps to deal with the different scenarios and different measurements, or maybe different apps that serve up the information. Openshift with an NVIDIA GPU running on Power makes a lot of sense. Absolutely does. So that's why I'd say it's strong. In saying that, we've got a government department in Canberra, quite a large one, that uses Power and loves Openshift and decided to choose Power as the platform for Openshift. So it's a great go-to for standard application development and also a great go-to for running containers.
Okay. Well, I wasn't across the ML and AI implications, so thank you for that. Certainly from our perspective, and our business works with clients with x86 workloads and works with clients with Power workloads. One thing that I've consistently seen is the total cost of ownership of Power. If you're looking at a full cost of ownership over a 3 or a 5 year window, in general, it will offer a lower cost than x86. But again, there is a horses for courses element that suits organisations, and that needs to be taken into account as well.
Absolutely, I agree.
Okay, Fytos, look, I appreciate the time that you've been able to offer us today and the insights. It's been fascinating, and I'm sure that we could easily do an episode 2 of this, because I know that there's just a whole lot of other stuff that you're itching to tell me. So I appreciate your time, and I certainly hope the insights that you've been able to offer are of use to our clients, to our viewers. So to our viewers, thank you for your attention today. Certainly Fytos and myself are both on LinkedIn, or you can contact us through links on this on the video. We'd love to continue the conversation with individual organisations if you're interested. And certainly we also appreciate any feedback that you might have for us for future episodes or topics that you might like to see. So again, I'd like to thank Fytos Charalambides from Red Hat for his time today, and I hope that you got something of benefit from our episode today. Thanks for watching.